Where have you brought me?
This is an old World War I trench on the Somme battlefield.
Then I guess we will be talking about trench warfare during World War I.
Right. Trench warfare occurred when the German offensive against France was halted and their von Schlieffen plan failed. Both sides dug in on the Western Front, and this grueling form of warfare ensued.
Let's also not forget the fact that by this time, a revolution in firepower had occurred, which was not matched by similar advances in mobility.
Yes, and as a result, trench warfare became a powerful symbol of the futility of war. Its image was that of young men going over the top into a hail of fire leading to certain death.
It has become associated with needless slaughter in appalling conditions. Combined with this is the view that brave men went to their deaths because of incompetent generals who failed to adapt to the new conditions of modern war.
In fact, the situation is far more complex. It is true that many generals sustained battles of attrition long after they had lost any purpose, especially early in the war. Many generals also sought breakthroughs rather than looking to hold land.
Yet, there was some innovation. The problems of trench warfare were recognized, and attempts were made to address them.
True. Solutions included improvements to artillery, better infantry tactics, and the development of tanks.
By the end of the war, attacks proved to be more successful and suffered fewer casualties. A country's main trench system was usually 3 parallel lines of trenches, interconnected by communications trenches.
Yes. We happen to be standing at the junction of one of those communication trenches.
The front line trench was lightly manned, typically being occupied in force only at dawn and dusk, the preferred times for attack.
Between 70 and 100 yards behind this was the second, or support trench. Soldiers would retreat to here if the front line trench was being bombarded.
This is also where most soldiers would spend their time when not manning the front line trench.
Between 300 and 500 yards further back was the reserve trench. Here, troops could amass for a counterattack if the front trenches were captured.
Behind this system, perhaps a kilometer or 2 to the rear, were another couple of trench systems.
Yes, these were ready to be occupied in the event of a retreat. This made any type of breakthrough virtually impossible.
This concept is called defense in depth. It certainly demonstrates how the defenders had the advantage. Trenches were typically about 3 meters deep and dug in a zigzag pattern.
In doing this, it ensured an enemy could never fire down the length of the trench.
The lip of the trench facing the enemy was called a parapet. It was banked with earth and sandbags, to provide additional protection.
The same was done with the rear edge of the trench. This protected the soldiers from shells falling behind them and from friendly fire.
The sides were reinforced with sandbags, wood, or corrugated metal, as is the case in this trench.
Most trenches had a fire step facing the enemy, although this one does not.
The floor was usually covered with wooden duck boards, as seen near my feet.
Dugouts were built in the rear of the support trench. These varied by country and by the situation, although those of the Allies tended to be shallower, perhaps 3 to 5 meters deep, while German dugouts might go 3 stories down and have concrete steps leading to them.
On many occasions, loopholes were built into the parapet, so soldiers could see out without exposing their heads to sniper fire. Another way to see over the parapet in relative safety was to use a simple periscope. This soldier is using one. Here we see the popular image of a trench assault. With bayonets fixed, soldiers are going over the top into no man's land.
This was the standard method of attack early in the war. Of course, we see few successful examples of this.
As time went on, it became more common to attack at night from an advanced post in no man's land.
Either way, artillery played 2 key roles in any assault.
Its first role was to kill or demoralize the enemy and wreck its defenses, especially barbed wire entanglements. The duration of this initial bombardment might last anywhere from a few minutes to multiple days.
Of course, these bombardments had their share of problems. They were often ineffective at destroying defenses. the enemy could ride them out in their dugouts, and they would tip off the enemy that an attack was coming.
Once the initial bombardment stopped, the troops would go over the top and charge no man's land for the enemy trench.
This is where artillery's second purpose comes in. A barrage of shells was fired to protect the attackers from an enemy counterattack.
This was very difficult to coordinate, but by late in the war, a creeping barrage became standard practice.
Of course, capturing an enemy trench was only half the battle. Once captured, it needed to be fortified and held against a counterattack.
And oftentimes that was easier said than done. The intensity of trench warfare caused about 10% of the fighting soldiers to be killed.
That's slightly more than double the percentage killed in World War II.
Medical services were rather primitive, and antibiotics had not yet been discovered. Minor injuries could prove fatal through infection and gangrene.
The Germans reported that 25% of arm wounds died from infection.
The Americans reported that 99% of abdominal wounds died. That's rather poor odds.
Of course, the greatest killer in World War I was disease. Sanitary conditions were horrible in the trenches, infections were common and included dysentery, typhus, and cholera. Many soldiers also suffered from lice and other parasites.
Poor hygiene led to fungal conditions, such as trench foot and trench mouth.
And let's not forget death from exposure. Trenches were cold, wet, and freezing in winter.
Yes. All in all, trench warfare was a horrible experience.